and welcome to episode 56 of On the Road with AutoTrader, where we make car stuff simple for Canadians. My name is Jodi and I'm the editor-in-chief of AutoTrader.
And my name is Dan Alika, and I am AutoTrader's road test editor.
Welcome back, Dan.
Thanks.
You were on a press trip last week,
I
which
was.
you also got to do some mountain biking.
I did, yeah. I was on Vancouver Island for the 2025 Subaru Forester first drive, and that's a very good vehicle, unsurprisingly. I mean, the last one was good. Major disappointment that the hybrid isn't here yet.
Yeah.
Apparently, so in the presentation, obviously, I mean, they knew that everyone was going to ask about it. So it was like, it will be here within a year. It was the statement. So kind of early, summer of 2025 is what it looks like. But it's just so late. And granted, like, not every similar entry in the segment has a hybrid option, but the best ones do.
The best
and
ones
the best
do.
selling ones do.
Yeah.
You've got
CR-V hybrid,
RAV4 hybrid, Ford Escape hybrid. Those are the top three sellers. Hyundai Tucson also has a hybrid.
Yeah.
Kia Sportage, Kia Sorento.
I mean, Subaru is usually pretty late with that kind of stuff.
For sure. And then apparently that same or similar hybrid powertrain is going to be offered in the Crosstrek, which is cool. But again, it's just like, man, this needed to happen.
We needed it yesterday.
Yeah. But yeah, I did have a pretty epic time riding mountain bikes with my friend Mark. And so it was, I was happy to come home, but it was like to give up all of that. Like, to give you an idea, so I always ride Kelso in Milton. So for those of you who don't know, just west of Toronto, it's really like, it's not quite in Milton. It's a little bit west of Milton, but we'll just call it Milton. Halton Conservation runs this mountaintop biking park. And I mean, I use the term mountain because it's like an Ontario mountain.
A hill.
But to give you an idea, so in one day of riding on Vancouver Island, just one day, I did the equivalent ascent of 12 Kelsos in one single ride.
That's impressive.
Like, it's crazy how much elevation gain there was.
We forget how flat Ontario is.
Yeah. So that's like the hard part about coming home is like, now I have to ride these like flat, low, like don't get me wrong, there are good trails around here, but not like out there.
Okay, and the reason why I brought up cycling is because this whole episode, it's really about how drivers and cyclists can be better to each other. I know there's a lot of animosity between those two groups of people, but both Dan and I are both drivers and cyclists. So we see things from both perspectives, which I think is really important. I feel like being a cyclist made me a better driver, and being a driver made me a better cyclist, if that makes sense.
Sure, yeah, I get that.
Yeah, and so this episode was actually suggested to us by our good friend at work, Barish Akurek, who's our VP of Intelligence and Insight at AutoTrader.
Who's also a driver and cyclist.
And a cyclist.
Yes.
Do you do a lot of cycling in the city?
Yeah, I mean, I have to like ride. I mean, yesterday I did 40 kilometers, the majority of which was getting to and from the trails. So yeah, I do ride on the road. And some trailways, which is an important distinction that we'll get to in a little bit here. But yeah, I do ride enough on the road and interact with. I remember like recently, I was making a left, and it was like a very long left turn lane. That was like my that I was in to make my left turn, and this guy was behind me, and I could sense he was behind me, and I kind of glanced over my shoulder and I saw him. And then he waited and then zipped around me and kind of like cut me off. And then we ended up at this red light, and his windows were down, and he like kind of glared at me. And I looked at him and I was like, dude, what do you want me to do here? And he was like, you're not supposed to be here. And I said, but I'm making a left-hand turn just like you. And he was like, you're supposed to be on the curb side. And I was like, but if I turned left, then that would put me in the middle of
and that is way more dangerous.
Yeah, like, so it's just like common sense seems to defy,
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think a lot of the confusion stems from people not understanding, like, what are the definitions of a vehicle? So the Ontario Highway Traffic Act defines a bicycle as a vehicle that belongs on the road. So, like, it's actually illegal to have to ride your bike on the sidewalk. So you must, as a cyclist, share the road with drivers.
Unless I think it's under the age of like
Yeah, something
16.
like that.
The simple way that I like to put it, and I will very snarkily say this to people all the time if I'm like walking and somebody comes up behind me on their bike, and I'm like, it's called a sidewalk, not a side bike, because that's what it is.
No, and that's true. And
Yeah.
I really hate when people like ring their bell at me on the sidewalk.
Yeah.
I'm like, just get off the sidewalk. You're not
It
supposed to be on here,
it
right?
is astonishing to me.
And so this is an important distinction to make because the only way we can make it work between all of us is if everyone is aware and following the same rules.
Yes.
And I feel like, especially where we live, we're on completely different pages with that.
Yeah.
But yeah, bikes are vehicles, which mean they must be on the road.
But then it's like the driver, sort of defensiveness. And when it comes to cyclists being on the road, I think there are too many drivers that take the name of this show way too literally. Okay.
They're really trying to own the road.
They're trying to own the road. And as much as I appreciate it in the context of this show, when it comes to like, being on to me, again, like you said, it's a vehicle, so it's no different than another driver. And I've said this to people when they cut me off or whatever, that I'm like, would you have done that to a car? If I were not on my bike, if I were in a car, an SUV or whatever, you would not act the way that you act. Yesterday, like for no reason, people generally, I do find when there are no bike lanes, for the most part, it does seem like people try to, make an effort to give me space. But yesterday in particular, this one, Tesla, go figure, like came so close to me for no reason. And the crazy part is, as it happened, I looked, so it was a 2-lane road, and I was on the shoulder. And I looked, and there was no one beside him. So it's not like he needed to be. And I'm not even asking that he necessarily changed lanes entirely, although I would feel much more comfortable in that scenario. But even just to give me a little bit of room.
Just a couple feet, right?
But instead, he, decided. And so my guess is either he didn't care or he wasn't paying attention. Either way, that's terrible. And, it's illegal. It's dangerous. And, as a vulnerable road user, that's what I would say. Pedestrians and cyclists, these are vulnerable road users. So when you are in your, 3, 4, 5,000 pound hunk of, steel and rubber and glass and whatever, it's like, a collision, even with another vehicle, given vehicle standards, safety standards these days, like you're going to be fine. But me, not so much. And sure, my helmet is great. And that's another thing. Cyclists who don't wear helmets are morons. There is literally no. And I got into a debate with people once back when I foolishly still had social media, because it was about Toronto and helmet laws. And people are like, oh, look at Amsterdam and no one wears helmets there and everyone's fine. It's like, well, A, you don't know that everyone's fine. But also, like, I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy. I visited Amsterdam. I didn't notice a difference. If these people think that concrete is softer in Amsterdam than it is here, but like you falling and hitting your head does the same damage in this part of the world as it does over there. So it's not about other vehicles.
Right.
It's about something as simple as a guy that I used to work with had a friend. They were in like a cycling club together. He was just an avid anti-helmet guy for whatever reason, and was biking, got his tires stuck in the streetcar tracks, fell, hit his head, and like lost all of his long-term memory.
Oh my God.
Couldn't remember his kids, couldn't remember how to do his job. Now, a lot of it came back, but weird things didn't. Like it would be like, oh, can you pass and he like would get frustrated. He couldn't think of it. And it would be something as simple as like a salt shaker.
Oh my goodness.
So that kind of stuff is like, sure, vehicle to vehicle interaction aside, maybe drivers in places like Amsterdam are better. They're more accustomed to working around cyclists, but like falling and hitting your head doesn't hurt less or do less damage. So it's like, if you don't wear a helmet while you're on your bike, you're stupid. I'm sorry. I hate to be rude, but that is just like a plain fact.
I mean, it's like not wearing your seatbelt when you're driving your car. Like it's just common sense, right?
For
it's so
everything
silly.
that we know about, like about head injuries, and people still choose, and to your point, like not wearing a seatbelt. But then there are still signs everywhere that say buckle up, it's the law, and when you go to the States, click it or ticket, because people still do that. So I guess
Right.
maybe we're spiraling into rant territory. Let's
I
back
mean,
up.
okay, so I just wanted to back up a little
Yeah.
bit because when we're talking about road safety,
Yeah.
predictability it plays a huge role in how safe we can all be.
Yeah.
If we can try to predict how other people are going to act on the road, it makes things safer for everyone. And so I think for cyclists and for drivers alike, signaling so important.
Huge.
And I know a lot of drivers don't signal, a lot of cyclists don't signal.
Yeah.
But here's just another reminder to everyone about how important it is to tell people what you're intending to do, because that is the biggest thing I think that helps keep both of us safe.
We're not mind readers. I try to just and you've said before, it's like I'm big on signaling when no one's around so that you'll remember to do it when other people are around. And I'm the same way on the bike. Of course, I don't do it. That's a scenario where I'm obviously not going to be waving my arm around when no one's around.
Right.
But for example, that scenario I was describing earlier, when I was using that left turn lane, I signaled with my arm to indicate that I was making a left turn so that no one thought, what is this crazy cyclist doing zipping across two lanes? But again, it's not like I cut through, because that, just like with a car, you signaling intent to make a move doesn't grant you the right to do so. You need to wait for for a break in traffic or for somebody to let you through so that you then make your move. But the signal is the first step to let other people know that you have an intention of changing course. When it's safe to do so, then you make your move.
Yeah, that's another thing I wanted to bring up, is that shoulder checking becomes even more important also for drivers and for cyclists.
Yeah.
Like we're doing the same stuff.
Yeah.
And that's really to ensure everyone's safety. But yeah, signal first, then check. Especially if you're in a bigger city where you might see more cyclists, it is even more important to be extra vigilant when checking your blind spots, even before turning right, turning left.
Yeah.
You really, really got to make sure that there's not a bike coming up in your blind spot.
Oh my God, Jodi, it also reminds me, like, anytime bike lanes come up, and I know they're controversial, probably everywhere, but in the GTA especially, but it's like every time the narrative is the same. It was like, well, I was driving down Bloor Street and I didn't see anyone in the bike lanes. And it's like, but that's like saying, like, well, I was on such and such a highway at 3:00 in the morning and there was no one on it. So why do we even have this highway to begin with? It's like, just because no one was there when you were there doesn't mean that those lanes, and I mean, there's new bike lanes near your place.
Right in my neighborhood in Etobicoke, we just got a huge stretch of brand new bike lanes. Like literally just last week they were installed, which I'm super happy to see, because that means that I feel a little bit safer biking around my own neighborhood. But it also means that there's a learning curve where a lot of drivers need to get used to those bike lanes. And for example, like not parking in the bike lane, which I still see a lot of people doing, even though there's signs everywhere.
Or so that was what I was. So basically, the bike lanes that we're seeing more of, the ones that are being installed, there's controversy in Mississauga as well, a stretch of Bloor that is in the process of being redone. So basically, the cities are removing lanes of traffic. So instead of just adding a bike lane, there's like a safety zone, for lack of a better term, that separates the live lane of vehicle traffic from the bike lane itself. But the problem is, people think that, oh, well, I'm turning right, so let me get out of the way. But really, you're not supposed to obstruct that at all. Like, you need to wait your turn and make sure that there are no pedestrians, which is another, I just want to take a little sidetrack here, because it reminded me of the new, and it's part of, like, these safe cities plans, whatever they call it, Vision Zero. I've noticed in the last, call it like the last year, but really it seems within 2024, it's ramped up, where phased traffic lights with the pedestrian signals.
Right.
So the pedestrian signal turns before the light turns for traffic. But there's been, to your point, there's been no campaign on social media, commercials, advertising
no
to say, hey, here's how the new signals work. And literally every single day, you and I saw it on the way here today to record, people, wait, they're watching whatever, like the north-south, you're heading eastbound and you're watching, okay, the north-south lights have turned red, so you're waiting your turn, and it's usually that few seconds. and then they see the pedestrian signal change and they accelerate through the intersection. And we saw a guy today roll right into, like, oh my God.
I see it all the time.
This whole idea of it's great in theory, but the execution is dumb. Either because to me, it's sort of like when roundabouts started to roll out in North America, and it's like people don't know how to use them, so it's going to take some time. But this is one of those things where it's actually having the opposite effect. Now, granted, I haven't seen any actual pedestrian collisions being hit by vehicles, but I've seen numerous close calls.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, how is that vision zero? You know?
Yeah, I think they have to do some sort of education campaign or like better signage or something instead of just making that switch.
Yeah, because it just doesn't, like, you can't just expect, yes, people should be paying attention, but if you've been doing it one way for years and years and years to suddenly without warning, that to me is like, let's say that Toronto suddenly changed it. No, it's illegal to turn right on red, but you didn't tell people that. It's like you've had decades of practice, with the ability to turn right on red, and then all of a sudden it's no longer permissible. You've got to let people know that this is the plan.
Absolutely. And even when there's signs, it's amazing how many times I'm waiting there when there's a no right turn on red, and someone like honks their horn at me. And I'm like, did you not see this massive sign?
Although there's one on Lakeshore that is one of those, it's during certain times of the, like during the commute. But I see, so it's, it's like no color. It's not lit up or anything when it's not in use.
Right.
And then you get there and people wait and wait and wait because they think that they're not allowed to turn right on red. I just wish, just make it simple, right? The sign should be self-explanatory. Either have a light with a green arrow and then, it's
something so simple, right?
It just doesn't, to me, it's overly complicated. But anyways, we're sort of sidetracked, but I think it runs parallel to the tracks that we've been on,
It's related. And I think, so for me, when I used to cycle a lot in the city, I used to cycle to work all the time. And I understand why there's so much animosity between cyclists and drivers, especially in the city. I've yelled at many drivers. I've like smacked a couple cars that came into close calls with me because they weren't paying attention. And I never like to be that angry, but like when you feel unsafe, like how else are you supposed to react, right? And so I just want to remind drivers to treat cyclists like another vehicle.
Yeah.
Expect them to act like another vehicle. We all have to follow the same rules. And that also means that cyclists are also subject to certain fines if they're not following certain rules as well.
But, and this part I sort of understand, but that's another one of those, arguments that people make. Oh, well, they, yeah, sure, in theory, but they never get pulled over and there's never a cop around. And it's like, yeah, I get it, man. But the point is, cyclists should be following the rules. That to me is just like that. That's no different than being like, well, everyone else is speeding, so I may as well do it too. It's like, look, sure,
that's not an excuse.
Yeah, and some cyclists break road rules, but I would argue, and granted, it's because there's more of them, but like even without that, just on average, there are more drivers breaking road rules than cyclists in terms of like using their phones, speeding, not signaling. If you could count the number of potential fines that you witness on the road, I guarantee you, if you are not being biased, you will see way more of those should be infractions from vehicles and than you would with cyclists.
I feel like drivers also have a bigger responsibility to act in a more safe way because they have like a shell protecting them. Like they're not as vulnerable as cyclists or pedestrians, so they need to take an extra step.
But to Jodi's point earlier, and like I mentioned off the top, like that idea of, okay, sidewalks are not side bikes. You shouldn't be on the sidewalk. But when it's a pathway, so, and Toronto's got a number of them and the waterfront and all that, those are shared pathways. And that's where it becomes fine. That's intended for cyclists. What it's not intended for are these morons on their e-scooters and their e-bikes.
That's a whole other debate. I don't even know if we have time to go into that today because there's so much confusion around e-bikes. It's because they're not supposed to be on the sidewalks, but they're on the sidewalks all the time. They're too fast to be in the bike lane, but too slow to drive in regular traffic.
Well, I don't know. They're pretty fast. Like easily drive in regular traffic. Some of the, especially the ones that people like modify and ungoverned.
So my issue is that I never know how to predict what they're doing because they can use the bike lane or they can use a regular road and they're zipping in and out of them.
And there's so many like types of these, you know, electric. So I'm not talking e-bikes as in like an electrically assisted
I saw one that looks like a motorcycle.
Yeah. Like we're talking about full, like you don't pedal, it just goes. But there are like electric skateboards. There are those one-wheelers. There are like the stand-up scooters.
Ones.
You know, the ones that look like motorcycles or mopeds or whatever. There are so many of them. But the problem is like, so I saw a guy the other day on a like single, this was, well, not the other day. This was a while ago. This was Mother's Day. I was out for a ride and the park was packed because of course people are out, you know, for nice family walks. It was a beautiful day. And this guy on one of those like big wheel, you know, it's like a massive rubber wheel and it's like a balance board almost. Full face helmet on, came flying down this little pathway through a forest and like almost smoked me on my bike.
Oh my God.
And this family with a stroller. And Jodi, I lost my mind on this guy. Because I'm like, dude, you're using a vehicle that can go almost as fast as a car.
So unsafe.
On a blind corner in a forest when the park is like, use your brain and use your judgment. If the main trail is packed with people, there are probably people on these little side trails too. You know?
That is so upsetting.
Like,
can you imagine if it hit that stroller?
And the worst part is these are, you know, just like a bike, like you don't have insurance and you don't require insurance. But then that also means that guy could easily just, you know, hit them and take off.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's no identifying number. There's no license plate. There's no nothing. It's like you know, so yeah, that's something that the city has been talking about and whatever. But I think it's kind of too far gone.
I mean, the problem is so widespread now that I'm not sure, like, obviously we need some kind of rules or regulations. I guess better late than never.
But that's why, like, cities like Mississauga, you know, were so against, and Toronto too, in fairness. But, like, so Toronto with the whole e-scooter thing, like, whatever, those Lime scooters and Bird and all that stuff, when they saw what was, they saw what was happening in other municipalities where, and you see it all the time. Go to a city where those scooters are popular.
Oh, it's the worst.
And people get like, they think it's like an easy way to get around when they're drinking. So it's like, you've got a bunch of drunk people on these stand-up rental scooters.
I've almost been smoked by a couple of them in Paris.
And people just leave them strewn about everywhere. So, I mean, on one hand, I look at Toronto's, you know, willingness to say, hey, let's not get into that. But then things that need regulation, like these vehicles, you know, that these like big, heavy battery-powered vehicles that can go 45, 50 kilometers an hour, and people are just ripping around like they own the road.
Yeah.
Not with AutoTrader.
Not in a good way. Own the road, but not in a good way. Yeah. Okay, I also just wanted to quickly go through some tips for both cyclists and drivers to remember, because I want you guys to leave this episode with like I learned something new today. So for cyclists, don't assume that a driver can see you.
Yeah.
You always want to make sure, like, either you're wearing high-vis clothing, you're making lots of eye contact, you're signaling. Don't assume that someone can see you because it's likely that they don't see you. Use your bell if you have to. I read this in the Ontario Highway Traffic Act for bikes. Never compromise your safety for the convenience of for a motorist behind you. And so I actually do see this a lot where cyclists will be like, oh, I'll squeeze closer to the curb so I can let this guy pass. It's actually less safe for you to do that.
Of course. Because also, like, let's say in that scenario, you squeeze close, you get too close, and you ping pong out, like, off of the curb and then into that moving vehicle.
Or you hit a sewer grate or something, right? Or a pothole.
That would be sewer not so great.
That's a good one. Yeah. But I thought that was a really good tip that I never really thought about it in that way.
That's just a good way to put it.
Yeah, it just put it into context for me. So for right turning vehicles, if you have a vehicle and you're turning right and there's a bike lane, if you're a cyclist, don't try to squeeze to the right because there's a high chance you're going to get run over. If it's safe, pass them on the left. Only if it's safe. If not, just wait behind them,
which
I know
one of those things that I talked about with those new style of bike lanes. You have to be even more vigilant because in that scenario, you technically have the right of way as the cyclist. That person turning right needs to treat you as they would treat a pedestrian crossing the road. But with this adjustment period to this new style, with this big wide,
Yep.
expanse between where they're turning right from and the bike lane, that is especially a scenario. Do not assume that they can see you. And that's
Yeah.
also one of those things. Cyclists do need to do better. And I do side with drivers in that case where,
Absolutely.
there's a sense of like entitlement, and it's like, nobody wants to end up injured or dead. Nobody wants to hit a cyclist. That's not the intent of the
Never.
average driver. But like,
It still happens often.
protect yourself. Don't think about the convenience of getting around that car, or expressing your outrage because that driver isn't driving properly. Sure, but it's like, is that worth putting yourself at risk to try to prove you can't prove a point if you're dead.
That's very well put. I think people forget that, right?
Yeah.
Like, they just get so consumed by their rage, they forget why they're angry in the first place, right? That's a really good point. And the last one I wanted to tell for cyclists is, like, stay out of blind spots as much as you can, especially for like trucks and larger vehicles. Again, visibility is so important, and if they can't see you, they can't react to you, right?
Exactly.
And for drivers, do not park or block bike lanes. Not only is it, it's like how much is the ticket now in Toronto?
I don't
like
know.
$250?
It's expensive.
It's a lot of money.
But it's also, you're putting vulnerable road users in at-risk positions that they have to then go around you. Dooring is also a huge problem.
That's a huge one. Just a simple check to see if there's anyone coming, so you don't door a cyclist and they go flying.
In fairness, like when I think I was like 21, I was on Queen West, and like I checked, and there was no one coming, and then I think I hadn't undone my seatbelt yet. That's actually why there's, what do they call it? Like the Dutch method or something, where it's like, instead of undoing your seatbelt or doing up your seatbelt like blindly, it's like in a very obvious, like, do it with your left hand so that you have to like turn over your shoulder, and you'll see if anyone's coming. There's
smart. I feel terrible because one time I was driving and I had checked, and then I opened my door and this cyclist came and she screamed, like her scream was the most shrill. I can still remember it to this day. And I said, I'm so sorry. I did not mean to. I had to apologize. I felt awful for doing that to her. And in the end, she was like, learn your lesson, and she like rode away. But I deserved that anger 100%. So
that's the thing, right? It's like, and so again, this is just us admitting, like, we're not perfect. We get it. And again, I don't think it's intentional. But that being said, like, that's the responsibility as a driver, as somebody who's parking, especially in the city. Like, you need to check and double check. The nice thing about like those extended blind spot monitoring systems that are out there, Hyundai's really good for this. Jaguar Land Rover,
they can see cyclists.
Yeah, safe exit assist, and it'll warn you so that if you're pulled over and you go to open the door, and some of them will prevent you from opening the door if you continue to do so, even though there's a vehicle or a cyclist approaching.
Yeah, I love those systems that they're really thinking about cyclists. So yeah, that's about it. Was there anything else you wanted to add in terms of like safety tips or tips and tricks?
No, I just think we need to respect each other, like you said, and just do better. And just stop being so defensive. Both like
everybody.
Drivers and cyclists,
Awesome. And before our Ask an Expert segment, here is a message from your friends at AutoTrader. Can't find a car at your ideal price point? AutoTrader is the answer. Car prices are dropping across Canada, and AutoTrader has got you covered with hundreds of thousands of cars for you to choose from. Use our price badges to find a great deal at a great price today. Visit AutoTrader for more. Today's Ask an Expert question comes from GRRR from Ajax, Ontario. Grr. Hi, I just listened to episode 53 and wanted to share a tech frustration. Oh, so this was the one we did about Apple CarPlay, or is tech getting worse?
Yeah.
Okay. So I had a 2010 medium trim Toyota Sienna when I started the car. My phone connected in less than 2 seconds every time.
Yep.
My 2013 RAV4 top trim JBL stereo is hit and miss. Even though it is newer and name brand, about a third of the time I have to wait 10 seconds. It just says connecting. Another third of the time I have to cycle through all of the audio sources a few times before it connects. The odd time I have to go to their menu to connect my phone again.
Yeah, I
share those frustrations, man. This happens to us all the time.
Yeah. And it happens in my person. So this is an interesting because 2013, this is pre CarPlay, but this is early Bluetooth days. And that's where the problem comes in. My Golf wagon is a 2014, and I have that same thing where most of the time it's fine. And then every now and then, especially if it's like Bluetooth audio on long road trips, all of a sudden, let's say like 4 or 5 hours into the drive, suddenly it'll just like stop working.
That's so random.
But I mean, this week I'm driving the Hyundai Ioniq 5N, and so it has wireless Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. I picked it up, tried to connect my phone. It said, "Do you want to connect wirelessly?" And I did, and it did not work. It would only work as a wired connection. So today I picked Jodi up on the way into the studio to record, and I like unplugged my phone, and then I plugged my phone back in, or I went to plug my phone back in when I restarted the vehicle, and it connected wirelessly. And it's like, when I did my drive and I was taking photos, like I probably stopped and started, I would guess, conservatively a dozen times that first day, because it's like reposition the car, stop, whatever.
Right.
And it just it needed to be hardwired. But then all of a sudden, miraculously today, and this is what we're talking about with these tech frustrations that have persisted from 2013,
Yep.
And they're ongoing in 2024.
Yep, my old car does it. My 2015 Golf is very sketchy when it comes to the Bluetooth connection, but also a brand new car I drive, I drove last week, also has the same issues. I just want predictability.
Yeah.
But thank you for your submission. If any of you have any gripes or frustrations or questions you would like to ask Dan and I, you can email us at expert@trader.ca. And yeah, that wraps up this episode. Thank you so much for joining us. Make sure to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast if you found it helpful or you just like the sound of our voices. Drive safe, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, guys.